Catch you back tomorrow.
Te whakarongo mai koe ki te reo irirangi o Aotearoa. This is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Lisa Owen. Haere aki nei. Waves in the front yard, what the sea level report means for houses hugging coastlines around the country. Wellington's south coast is in the red zone. We speak to the Mayor live. And why are people still allowed to build in high-risk areas? The tax and spend debate fires up, and it's not even election year. National lays out the foundations of its economic strategy. So are they solid? Hugs and teary reunions at Auckland Airport as tourists touch down for the first time in more than 2 years. The Prime Minister marks the day by telling US businesses New Zealand is ready to reopen. And we've got a whale of a tale too, the kind that wags, not the other kind. You can watch us live on Facebook.
RNZ News at 5. Ahi Marie, I'm Evie Ashton. The new NZ Sea Rise website that shows how New Zealand's coastline will be affected by rising sea levels and land subsidence has been hit by a cyber attack. Victoria University of Wellington Earth Sciences and project co-leader, Professor Tim Naish, says there were people all around the country wanting to access the new information.
It was really frustrating. Initially it was working and we were quite excited because we were seeing a lot of activity, and then the activity looked a little bit unusual. We were getting more than 1,000 hits per second, and that ultimately crashed the website. There was some unusual IP addresses coming in there.
The website has crashed several times today but is now up and running again. Today at Lyell Bay, next to Wellington Airport, locals are alarmed the capital will see a 30-centimetre rise in sea level in the next 18 years.
The window for making climate action is quickly closing, and I think we really need to take this seriously and get motivated.
You know, we're looking to buy a place potentially in the next few years. Would I buy in a coastal area? I'd think twice about it, definitely.
I am kind of pessimistic. I think that we're kind of past the point of making much of a difference to the sea levels.
The changes that are happening, if we're not careful, are going to be irreversible, and it's up to the people in power to get on board to actually do something about it.
The Prime Minister has again ruled out introducing a wealth tax after comments on breakfast television led to accusations she might. The National Party launched an attack in response, saying New Zealanders can't trust Labour on tax. Here's our political reporter, Katie Scotcher.
Jacinda Ardern reiterated on the AM show this morning she wouldn't introduce a capital gains tax while she's Prime Minister, but did not rule out a wealth tax. National Party leader Christopher Luxon says Ms Ardern was signalling she plans to introduce such a tax and needed to clarify her plans. At her post-cabinet press conference this afternoon, Ms Ardern said her policy is not to introduce a wealth tax, and that remains unchanged.
2 recent arrivals into New Zealand are now isolating at their homes as a second person is confirmed with the BA4 variant of Omicron. The first case of the new subvariant at the border was reported yesterday. Today's COVID-19 update shows 6,636 new community cases and 7 deaths. The Prime Minister has accepted the government failed in its efforts to improve the managed isolation system and make it fairer. The High Court last week found the MIQ lottery didn't sufficiently allow individual circumstances to be considered and prioritised, and the emergency allocation categories were too tight. Jacinda Ardern says the court accepted the government's rationale for keeping MIQ.
But what they've looked at is how that operation, the exemption regime that was operating, and the way that we implemented some extra tools, whether or not they were right. One thing I would acknowledge is that our attempts to make it fairer were found, obviously, by the court to not have improved the system, and I accept that.
The Prime Minister says MIQ was the best of a range of bad options. She says the government is still considering its response. And Countdown isn't expecting any supply problems after it was revealed Edmonds is importing flour from Australia to meet demand in New Zealand. Adverse wheat growing conditions in the South Island have left Edmonds unable to source enough New Zealand wheat for its flour. Goodman Fielder says in order to ensure Kiwis have access to flour, it's urgently sourced wheat from Australia, which will be milled and packed in New Zealand. Countdown says it hasn't experienced any flour shortages over the last few months. It is, however, seeing significant pressure on the cost of wheat due to the ongoing invasion of Ukraine, but does not expect supply problems. To sport, and a fairy tale finish wasn't to be for the Black Ferns Sevens on their return to the World Series circuit more than 2 years after they last competed. The Black Ferns Sevens suffered a last gasp loss to Australia in the final of the tournament in Canada, going down 21-17. Winger Portia Woodman admits getting used to competition again takes time.
We're still trying to figure out combos and how we all gel together. It's quite difficult. When Aussie got that last turnover, we had 10 seconds left on the field. All we had to do was hopefully hold on to the ball for maybe one more ruck and then it would have been over. It's interesting knowing that just the slight, just the 10 seconds, it would have been for a whole completely different game.
Period pain has hampered golfer Lydia Ko's bid for a second tournament win this year. The world number 3 finished tied for third, 2 shots behind American winner Marina Alex at the Palos Verdes Championship in California. Ko says she had back pain during the final round and at one stage needed physio treatment.
It's that time of the month, so when that happens, my back gets really tight and I'm all twisted, and it's not the first time that Chris has seen me twisted, but it felt a lot better after he came, so yeah, there you go.
Meanwhile, fellow New Zealand golfer Stephen Elker has enjoyed more success on the Champions Tour with a 4-shot win at the Insperity Invitational in Texas. And the Golden State Warriors have beaten Memphis Grizzlies 117-116 in their opening NBA Western Conference semi-final series. Steven Adams was missing from the Memphis squad due to COVID protocols. That's the news.
Cracking down on tenants.
And with the bad behaviour of those tenants, they are creating hell within their neighbourhoods.
Cracking down on truants.
It's looking over the fence and saying to your neighbours, "Oh, your children aren't at school today. Is there something wrong? Can I help?"
Cracking down on mate.
But if you go, "Now listen here, mate," and you elongate the A, well, I don't know. I mean, is that a form of bullying?
You beauty. Morning Report weekdays from 6 on RNZ National.
You're on Checkpoint with Lisa Owen next. First, the short forecast from NZUS to midnight Tuesday. Northland, Auckland, Coromandel and Bay of Plenty, fine and cloudy periods with isolated showers. Waikato, Waitomo, Taumarunui, Taupo and Taihape. Mostly fine, some areas of fog overnight. From Taranaki to Wellington, mostly cloudy. A few showers about Taranaki, Kapiti and Wellington that are clearing later tomorrow. Fine weather for Gisborne, Hawke's Bay and Wairarapa with a few clouds. Nelson and Marlborough, cloudy periods and a few showers, becoming confined to Golden Bay and the outer Marlborough Sounds tomorrow. Mostly fine for Canterbury, Otago and Southland. However, there is the odd shower about Stewart Island, some brief rain possible in North Canterbury until this evening, and low cloud or fog about Canterbury Plains from tomorrow evening. For Bulla, Westland and Fiordland, mainly fine about Northern Fiordland and Southern Westland, occasional rain or showers elsewhere. And for Te Kohu, the Chatham Islands, cloud is increasing. A few showers are developing tonight. It's 7 minutes past 5. We'll have news headlines for you at 5:30.
Nā mihi iwi, tēnā koutou katoa, no mai haere mai ki Checkpoint I tēnei rā, ko Lisa Owen tēnei. Rising sea levels in cities that are slowly sinking. Scientists say the impacts of sea level rise will be knocking on people's doors sooner than expected. New data from New Zealand Sea Rise has painted a stark picture of who will be most impacted by a rising coastline. Our reporter Kirsty Frame has more.
A rising sea and sinking cities means there's a fast approaching tide coming in. The new mapping shows many parts of the country face inundation in less than 2 decades. Today at Lyell Bay, right next to Wellington Airport, there's plenty on people's minds.
I think we've had facts for a long, long time that we've failed to act on, and I think the time is, the window for making climate action is quickly closing, and I think we really need to take this seriously and get motivated.
We're looking to buy a place potentially in the next few years. Would I buy in a coastal area? I'd think twice about it, definitely.
I am kind of pessimistic. I think that we're kind of past the point of making much of a difference to the sea levels.
The changes that are happening, if we're not careful, are going to be irreversible, and it's up to the people in power to get on board to actually do something about it.
Most of the country's coastal areas are in target, but sinking areas such as Auckland, Wellington, Banks Peninsula, Napier and Marlborough Nelson are set for increased sea rise. Victoria University of Wellington's Dr James Renwick says the times are changing.
The reality is the coastline is moving inland and we have to move with it. Now, it's not as though you've got to sort this out by next weekend. We've still got 20 years or more to get organised. But the reality is that for a lot of households and a lot of communities where they're living now, they're not going to be able to be living in a few decades.
Dr Renwick says the measurements today also assume that we meet our global emission reduction targets. Just 30 centimetres of sea level rise will cause once-in-a-century flood damage every year, which means if the world doesn't hit its emission targets, the sea level rise could be worse than what's on the map. Dr Renwick says we can't be complacent.
We could definitely be in even more trouble, and that's a real worry. So if you haven't seen big effects where you live yet, we don't want to be complacent. We'll be seeing more and more of these coastal erosion events around the country.
Moving homes out of harm's way will be costly and difficult. But Belinda Story, Managing Director of research organisation Climate Stigma, says we can't avoid the facts.
The problem is growing every day, and the longer we delay in taking action, the more expensive it's going to be. But taking action today is often unpopular, and it's difficult.
But she says the market is ignoring that risk.
We are building more and more houses right at sea level, and the market is ignoring those risks. And part of the reason the market is ignoring that risk is they're not seeing any intervention by government. And people know that in a disaster, the government steps in.
Belinda Story says local governments have limited resources and it will be central government which need to step up the finances. The sea rise mapping site has remained down for most of the afternoon. On its social media account, a spokesperson said on top of heavy traffic, the site was hit by a cyber attack. NZ Sea Rise says it's working to restore the maps as soon as possible.
Well, joining us now is Wellington Mayor Andy Foster. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Lisa.
Let's start with Owhero Bay, right? Its prognosis is bad according to this new data. What are the options there?
Well, I think the new data basically is reinforcing something that we already knew. And I suspect most people in the back of their minds already knew it. That the sea is rising. And it's a number of parts of the country, and we knew Wellington was one of those parts where the land's sinking, which doubles up the sea level rise and brings that issue of inundation closer.
But your runway just got 40 years shorter, so what are you going to do?
Sorry, say that one again.
Your runway just got 40 years shorter, so we're talking 2 decades now for these significant changes, as opposed to 50 to 60 years.
Yeah, the runway I think is 8 or 9 metres above sea level, so it's in a better place for many things. So I think particularly for some of the residents in coastal areas, it's a particular challenge.
So again, Owhero Bay, what are your options? What can you do?
Well, I mean, we take it as the big picture. I mean, the options basically are we defend or we retreat or we modify, and the answer to that is going to be different for different places. One of the things that we are doing, one of the responsibilities we do have is in planning, and I think I heard the report from Kirsty saying that we're still building a lot of property close to the sea, and obviously that's something that just puts more and more properties in harm's way. And so we're about to notify a new district plan, and natural hazards, including coastal sea level rise, are part of the focus there.
So will they be marked on people's land information?
Well, they'll certainly be marked on the district plan maps, which I'm sure means they'll have to go through into land information as well.
Is there anything you can do to stop people building on high-risk sites?
What we've done is the way it's been laid out is that we've got areas which are particularly at risk, and then areas which have a medium risk, so high risk and medium risk. In the high risk areas, there are some sort of activities which we would say you'd need a special consent. That's a non-compliant consent that's really hard to get. So things sort of sensitive like childcare centres and hospitals and things like that. But also, if you want to, the government's recent 3 houses per property would not apply in those areas, and that's the areas which are subject to inundation, so you wouldn't be able to densify in those areas. You would be able to replace an existing house.
That's stupid, isn't it?
No, you'd be able to replace an existing house, but you wouldn't be able to build a new one. Okay. So you wouldn't be able to put more dwellings in harm's way. And
understand
of course, the issue there is that if you start doing that and investing in those areas, increasingly insurers and banks are going to be saying, well, actually, we're not going to cover you. We're not going to give you a mortgage.
You mentioned retreat or mitigation, right? So when you look at Ōwhero Bay, when is it time to say, okay, that's it, we're not going to do any more work in this area, it's time for people to pack their bags and start to move on?
Look, all of those areas will be in the hazard zone, and so that's going to affect people's ability to be able to build new houses. It doesn't mean that you've got to take the house away. Some areas we will protect by virtue of seawalls, etc., to the degree that we can. In some areas it won't be economic to do that. So as I said, it's going to vary between different areas, and I can't give you an answer to that specific location because that's something you need the technical detail, the engineering detail.
Yeah, in terms of cost, if you look at Ōwhero Bay with the seawall replacement, and I think you did some grading in that area in December.
Yes,
already, what's the price tag for that? How much does it cost you every year?
I'm not sure that the grading's particularly expensive, but it's the seawalls. And for example, we lost a good chunk of seawall at Island Bay. It cost us, I think, about $1.5 million to replace that. And that's an existing sea level. So if the sea's, 30 centimetres, 60 centimetres higher, that's going to happen much, much more often. It's going to be much, much harder to defend those sort of areas.
Who do you see as picking up the tab for all of this stuff?
Look, a huge question for the country, and I have sympathy for the people who've been there a long time, before we really knew that sea level rise was a thing. But if you're building properties, in the last few years, and you then expect to turn around and say, well, I've got a problem, somebody else bail me out, I think it's a bit harder to run because the money's got to come from somebody. So I think people have got to go into these things with their eyes wide open if they want to take that risk. They're taking that risk.
Andy, on that point, in the UK, there's a compensation process, right? But only for houses built before 2009. Where do you think the cutoff should be? You just said if you've built a house recently, well, you know the consequences on that. Basically, it's on you. So what do you consider? Where's the cutoff timeline for you should have known better?
Oh, look, I think this is a discussion that a lot of people will bring their expert views to bear, but I know that we were certainly looking at climate change before that as if this is going to affect sea level rises. Sometime in the early 2000s, I think we were getting to be well aware of these sort of things. So, I don't know, it's going to be a debating point, but I would have thought it's going to be in that sort of vicinity.
Appreciate your time. That is Andy Foster, who's Wellington's mayor there. Homai o whakaaro, we would love your feedback. Should you be allowed to build new houses on high-risk sites or replace one that's already there? And if you own a house that was bought after a certain date, should be on your own in terms of any kind of retreat or mitigation costs. Nō reira anei na kaupapa mo te hōtaka nei. Send us your thoughts on that and rising sea levels. You can text me, pātui mai, 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, or the email address is checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. An economic approach that will get Kiwis ahead. That's how National Leader Christopher Luxon is selling his party's vision for the country in a pre-budget speech. Luxon says the government has no plan except to spend more money, and he's unveiled what he calls the 5 critical levers of prosperity. Christopher Luxon joins me now. Kia ora, you want a government that isn't just spin, you said in your speech. I'm really well, thanks. You've said in your speech you want a government that isn't just spin. Are you more than spin?
No, look, today was really us taking a step back and saying, look, we've got a massive cost of living crisis here in New Zealand. We've got the highest level of inflation for 30 years. We've got higher than most of our trading partners, and it's causing real pain and it's getting a grip on the economy. Labor's only plan is really to spend money. It's up 68%. We're spending $52 billion more this year than we spent in 2017. And to be honest, doesn't matter which area you pick, we're not getting good outcomes. And so what we've got to do is actually kickstart the economic engine here in New Zealand, enlarge it. And that's what I was talking about today. So it wasn't a day of deep policy. It was actually saying, taking a step back and saying, what's the economic framework by which, when you look around the world and say, why do other small advanced economies have more wealth than New Zealand? It gets you into these 5 things.
Okay, well, let's go through some of the detail of your speech because it's important, right? You say you want a country where you can buy a home with a few years of hard work and saving. So what's a few years? I mean, how soon should you be able to buy a house?
Well, the real challenge is this, right? We actually have to find a way to make an economy that generates higher income, raises wages for everybody. And so the way we do that is you invest very strongly in education, you invest very strongly in infrastructure, technology, business environment, and then making sure we're connected with the world. If you think about education, what I was trying to say today, look, when we've got 40% of our kids not making regular attendance, when our maths, reading and science scores have slipped dramatically versus the rest of the developed world, when only 60% of our kids can pass a basic 15-year-old global reading test, we've got some real challenges. That's not just a social problem, that's actually an economic crisis because that's what the New Zealand economy will be limited to in 30 years' time. And so, if we can get better education in place, we ultimately end up being able to access higher sectors and value sectors, which drives to higher incomes and wages for everybody. So that's what this speech was about today, was taking a step back and saying, hey, listen, look, we do a lot of tactical conversations here. We want to do a strategic conversation around the drivers of economic growth and prosperity.
I understand the big picture that you're painting, right? But you've specifically said in this speech that you want a country where people can buy a home with a few years of hard work. Average house price in Auckland is $1.2 million. The median income is $59,000. So what are you suggesting, that we're going to get to the point where everyone is making $200,000 a year and you can buy that house in 4 to 5 years?
Well, what we're suggesting here today was a lot of our conversation was what's the right environment. We've got actually developers, I think, have spent something like $1.3 billion on consenting alone this year. We've actually got a delay now where it takes the time to actually get a consent to build a house has actually doubled over the last decade. So we've got to go back and look at what's in the underlying regulations that we've got that's holding us back, because this isn't how other countries actually do it. They actually do build things very quickly. They actually get through the consenting process quickly. It doesn't cost heaps that then gets put into higher prices and higher price houses that makes it more unaffordable for people. So again, what I'm trying to get to is the economic fundamentals and foundations by which we can build a more prosperous New Zealand.
Again, in education, you say you want to make better use of information to drive results. What do you mean by that? Look at test scores, bring back national standards?
Well, no, what we mean by that is actually we need to be able to say it isn't working today. And, we'll build over the next 18 months, don't worry, very comprehensive policy. We won't need working groups and endless reviews. We'll get there from day one, we'll be ready. But what I'm saying is very obvious. Like, to be honest, Lisa, we can't tell you who those 40% of children that aren't making school regularly actually are. We need to be able to tell and identify our kids that are falling behind in math, reading and science, because otherwise they're not going to show up for class. They're going to sit in the back of the classroom really disillusioned and around education. And so
it sounds a bit, I'm sorry to interrupt, but it sounds a bit airy-fairy. And I say this because you have pointed out specifically in your speech, you want a government that isn't just spin, but actually delivers. And what you have delivered today is broad brushstrokes, no detail, and some might say that's spin.
Well, I'll tell you what's happening is in the Labor government at the moment, all we're doing is spending money and there's no economic plan sitting there underneath it all. And so you've got to be really clear. Why? How do you spend $5 billion more on education and get worse attendance and academic achievement results? How does that actually happen? How do you spend $2 billion on mental health and you actually don't give people access to mental health services? So, the answer here really clearly is the government just keeps as addicted to spending. They're not focused on outcomes, and that's what I'm here to do. That's what I came to politics to do, and that's what my team's here to do, is actually how do we improve the educational outcome? Why does it take so long to build infrastructure in New Zealand and actually get things up and running and moving? Why is it that we haven't embraced technology well enough to be able to get our firms more efficient, to be able to create higher wages? Why is it that it's actually hard to even start a business in New Zealand?
So just very
really hard
quickly,
to build one.
Just very quickly, when you talk about critical levers of prosperity, who exactly are you speaking to? Are you speaking to the boardroom or are you speaking to everyday voters?
Everyday voters.
Do you think that's the language of everyday voters, 5 critical levers of prosperity?
Every New Zealander understands that we need to improve our education system. Every New Zealander understands we need to improve our infrastructure. Now, the way we do that is that we have to have a strong economy. If you want a really great healthcare system, you need a strong economy. If you want a better education system, you need a strong economy. If you want to do the climate adaptation work that you were just talking with Andy Foster about, you need a strong economy to be able to do that. So, that's the underpinning by which we get to do everything else that we want to do in this country. And what we're saying is, look, our economic engine is too small and it's not firing right. And we've got to be able to go back and say, why is it? Because otherwise we'll wake up and ask ourselves some very serious questions about why is it that New Zealanders are less wealthy than other small advanced economies in the world.
Thanks for your time this evening. That's Christopher Luxon, who is, the boss of the National Party. It is 23 minutes past 5. Kia mau tonu mai. You're listening to Checkpoint on RNZ National. The Prime Minister has twisted and turned over a wealth tax today as the opposition revisited a well-worn debate from 2020. Jacinda Ardern first refused to rule out introducing a wealth tax in a future term, despite having done so during the last election campaign. And by day's end, she was back to where she started in 2020. Here's our Deputy Political Editor, Craig McCulloch.
Buckle up, it's budget season. Musing over money, investigating infrastructure and talking tax.
You're not ruling out the potential for a wealth tax, the potential for a stamp duty.
We have not worked on our tax policy for 2023.
The day began with every politician's least favourite game. Is it in or out? Jacinda Ardern on 3's AM show was asked about a proposed wealth tax. Not on the table this budget, or even this term. But what about in the future?
Anything's possible.
Oh, we haven't formulated a policy.
I know, I totally get that. But
and I'm in all honesty, it's just not something that we've worked on yet.
It prompted predictable headlines. PM refuses to rule out wealth tax. Except here she is, way back in 2020, seemingly pledging never to implement one.
I won't allow it to happen as Prime Minister.
The opposition quickly seized on this morning's comments, predicting a flip-flop, a U-turn, a broken promise in the making. Christopher Luxon says Labour's clearly cooking up more taxes.
Tax. I am really concerned about where the Prime Minister's going with it, and she needs to front and say what's in and what's out.
Forget the budget, it's starting to feel like an election, the battle lines being drawn. National's media release was headlined, "You Can't Trust Labour on Tax," a callback to its attack ads of 2019 and 2020.
Capital gains tax, fuel tax, regional fuel tax, income tax.
The opposition barrage may have refreshed the PM's memory. By this afternoon, she had circled back to her 2020 position.
We've already said that our policy is not to introduce that, and that remains our position. Nothing has changed.
The conflict speaks to a wider point of contention between the two parties, and one directly tied to this month's budget. Finance Minister Grant Robertson has promised the budget will deliver $6 billion of new annual spending, pegged predominantly to climate change and the health system overhaul. National says it's hard to justify, and that the government's record spending will ultimately lead to more taxes.
Spend money, but make sure you get outcomes and delivery for it. Don't just spend money and then get no outcomes. That's unacceptable.
It's high-stakes stuff. A report out today reveals the immense task ahead to fix the country's infrastructure and the immense price tag to match, some $31 billion a year. Mr Robertson says the sum is too high. New Zealand can't just build its way out. It will have to be smarter.
We need to stop simply trying to put a band-aid on our issues, and we need to do all we can to future-proof the country's infrastructure.
He'll have more to say on that at a business breakfast tomorrow, the first of a series of pre-budget speeches. The budget itself will be unveiled on May the 19th, but expect to hear much more over the next few weeks.
The first international flights have touched down in Auckland in over 2 years, bringing in tourists, family and Kiwis home from holidays or business trips. A historic and entirely unprecedented decision to close the border 767 days ago has ended. New Zealand is now open for business. Our reporter Jordan Bond and cameraman Nick Monroe were out there to welcome the flights.
A couple formerly separated by the Pacific Ocean, now together properly, hugging in real life.
Finally made it. I originally applied for a working holiday visa in February of 2020, and I'm finally here.
Iris, a Kiwi, and David, an American, finally reunited after countless FaceTimes.
Until today, I had never been within 6,000 miles of this country, and my first time here, I'm home.
They were on the first flight to touch down from Los Angeles at about 5:30 this morning. Robin had flown in from the US, one of the few tourists on the flight.
I'm waiting to come here for years.
Is this your first time?
And I'm finally here. So,
welcome. How does it feel?
Amazing.
An open border is giving Kiwis the confidence to not only holiday, but see their families or do business overseas. Fraser and Megan, both New Zealanders, were finally able to get to the States with their toddler, who hadn't seen his grandparents since he was a newborn.
So we're just returning. I just went home to see my parents for the past 3 weeks. It was incredible. It was unreal. End of a long nightmare, really.
I saw this guy when he was 5 weeks old, so he's grown up a lot since then. Yeah. What was it like seeing your parents?
It was surreal, really.
Tourism Minister Stuart Nash was all smiles wandering around the arrivals hall, shaking hands with tourists and giving out peanut slabs.
This is the first time that, as a Minister for Tourism, I've been able to say I'm at Auckland International Airport. It's just the beginning of the reopening. We're not quite back to normal, but business people can now leave and do business overseas. Kiwis can go on holiday and catch up with their loved ones, but more importantly, we can welcome back international tourists. We're waiting for a long time for this, and it's so good to see.
Mr Nash says the government got the balance right between the health of New Zealanders and that of the tourism sector, having closed the border for over 2 years.
Look, I really am, because the number one job of this government is to keep our communities safe, and we've done that. There's been a lot of debates, a lot of angst, a lot of arguments, a lot of soul searching around the cabinet table with every single decision we make. But underlying everything we do, it's about keeping our communities safe, and I think we've done a really good job on that.
He says he does fully acknowledge the difficulty so many in tourism faced, and the government's put $100 million into Tourism New Zealand to remarket the country. New Zealanders are still coming home too. Jessica gave her mum, Sally, a long, teary hug in the arrivals hall.
Really exciting. Just super exciting.
She's been gone 4 years.
Yeah. First time back in 4 years, so it's exciting, to say the least.
And a mum gets her daughter home.
So overwhelmed and just so good to have her back. Yeah, it's been a long time.
How's the last few years been for you?
Oh, tough. Yeah, it's been tough. It's obviously tough having my daughter live in London and not be able to travel and see her, and it's just exciting to have her home.
This man had no idea it was the first day of international flights and found himself a bit bewildered at all the commotion.
What were you expecting when you arrived?
An empty airport? No.
Friends and family are meeting lockdown babies for the first time.
First time, 18 months old.
Yeah, wow, and so your family here and getting to meet him for the first time?
Mum and Dad have met him, but my brother, friends, a lot of other people haven't.
Amazing.
Plenty of introductions.
David from Cincinnati had a long flight, but already feels home.
About 32 hours of travel in the end, and I'm exhausted, but this is all worth it.
But you're here.
I'm here to stay, at least for a year.
Tourists from more than 60 visa waiver countries can now come into New Zealand. They and any other arrivals must take a rapid antigen test on their first and fifth days in the country, which they're given as they arrive. In the meantime, they can go wherever they like, no quarantine, just out the door to explore New Zealand.
And if you were listening to that report on radio, a report from Jordan and Nick, the video will go up on our webpage. Check it out. Kia ora e te iwi e Hariaki nei e a checkpoint. The Prime Minister declares New Zealand ready to reconnect with the US. The Queen of the Discotheque dies and stand by for a splash as Auckland's whale tails go under the hammer. Ho mai o whakaaro, we'd love your feedback on anything you've heard on the programme this evening. Do get in touch. Lots flooding in, excuse the pun, about rising sea levels. You can text us on 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, or you can send us an email, checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Time to get to the headlines now. Anei a iwi mina pita kōrero.
The new NZUS Rise website, showing how New Zealand's coastline will be affected by rising sea levels, has been hit by a cyber attack. The website also crashed several times today due to high levels of traffic. A report on the site shows parts of Wellington will face serious sea level rise decades earlier than expected. New projections show many parts of the country face inundation in just 18 years. Victoria University of Wellington professor Tim Naish says sea levels could be 30 centimetres higher in some areas of Wellington by 2040. A second case of the BA4 variant of Omicron has been confirmed at the border. The first case was reported yesterday, also at the border. Both people are isolating. There are 6,636 new community cases of COVID and 7 people have died. The Prime Minister is again ruling out introducing a wealth tax after comments this morning led to accusations she might. A group representing renters says a proposal from the Property Investors Federation to fix the rental crisis just helps them line their own pockets. The plan includes harsher penalties for problem tenants, being able to give 90 days notice to end a tenancy for any reason, and increasing the maximum bond. 8 construction sites run by Armstrong Downs Commercial have been temporarily closed. The Wellington Construction Company has gone into liquidation. Electricity generation, water services and responding to sea level rise are top of the list of investments identified in the Infrastructure Commission's first strategy. The report has made nearly 70 recommendations aiming to transform infrastructure, lift economic performance and improve well-being. And Edmonds is urgently importing wheat from Australia after a poor growing season in the South Island left it unable to source local wheat for its flour. The current Edmonds packaging states that only New Zealand wheat is used, but it's being updated to reflect the change. Those are the headlines. Our next news and weather is at 6.
Kia ora rā e ho, nau mai hoki mai. This is Checkpoint, ko Lisa Owen tēnei. It's time for the business news, ko taku hoi in Naianei, ko Nona Peltier, who is in the studio. Nona, importers and exporters should plan for ongoing supply chain disruptions and higher freight costs. Well, that's a story that keeps rolling on, isn't it?
Well, some bad news was delivered by the head of one of the country's biggest logistics firms, that's Mainfreight, and that's Don Brady, told a group of people meeting today, the United States, New Zealand Council, that there's been, the ships that were expected to arrive and I guess alleviate some of that clogging. It's not happened. They're being diverted to support the war effort in Ukraine. And as long as that's going on, plus all the other things that are going on, the ships that we hope will carry our goods and services to and from New Zealand are not available. So it's air cargo. And air cargo is expensive. And until passenger numbers rise to what was perhaps a normal level, it's going to be expensive because there are fewer flights and so forth.
And planes are smaller.
And the planes are smaller, yeah.
And I suppose it's a cycle, isn't it? Because the ships that come over offload, then the empty containers are used to then take our stuff offshore. And if it's not coming our way, it's not leaving either.
Well, just recently there was an image I saw from Shanghai showing how many ships are waiting to be loaded, unloaded. It's really congested. So yeah, people are going to be waiting for their goods and services their goods to arrive, but and of course that's going to cost a lot more. So people are going to have to be planning more, importers, exporters, to make sure that they have whatever it is they need.
Okay. Let's talk about this other company with a slightly funny name, Fortescue Future Industries.
Yes,
so
right.
they're going to be becoming a force in the development of New Zealand's green hydrogen. Who knew it? Who are they?
Well, you may never have heard of them, but they're quite big internationally. They're one of the world's largest mining companies producing iron ore, for example. So they're an Australian-based firm, and they've been looking around New Zealand for a while now in the area of green hydrogen. So they're going to be partnering with one of our biggest gas pipeline companies, First Gas, and they're going to look at producing green hydrogen and then mixing it up with natural gas to supply consumers with a lower emission source of fuel, right? But they've been also talking to the Meridian Group. You know, the Meridian Energy is looking at doing green hydrogen now in Southland. They've also been talking to the folks at what was known as Marsden, now it's known as Channel, about producing green hydrogen there. So these projects are all in early stage development. Whether or not they go ahead, I guess the feasibility of whether we can produce a competitive product here with green hydrogen is yet to be seen. But they're going to be working at it. So we're going to hear a lot more from this particular company because they see a lot of green opportunity here in New Zealand.
Right, I'll remember the name next time. What numbers do you bring for us, Nona?
Not the best numbers today. Let me just go back to this. Yeah. So look, there's a holiday going on in Asia, 3-day holiday. Why don't we get a 3-day holiday? I don't know. But anyways, we don't have one. They do. And so our index took a lead from Wall Street over the weekend. It was a terrible, terrible finish to last week. It's led to its deepest fall since 2020. So big bad news going on in the United States in terms of the markets, and we had nothing to take the lead here. So we ended up down 100 points. We fell 0.8% to 11,784. And the New Zealand dollar is under a lot of pressure. We're at 64.3 US cents. We haven't seen those levels since June 2020. And it's despite that the Reserve Bank of Australia may lift interest rates tomorrow, that's the speculation, we're still in the doldrums here. Interest rates don't seem to be able to move our currency, and that's really a big US dollar story. What's going on internationally, that's what's weighing down our markets. So 64.3 US cents, 91.2 Australian, and 51.2 pence.
And people are going to be more interested in those numbers now that they can move around a bit more. Thanks, Nona. Nona Peltier there with Business News. Now, if you are trying to watch us on Sky Channel 83 tonight, unfortunately it's down for maintenance, but never fear, you can still watch us on the RNZ website or Facebook, and we're on Sky Channel 421. So the number again, Sky Channel 421. Do tune in. The Prime Minister has declared New Zealand open for business. She told a summit on New Zealand and US business today that the country is moving into a new phase of its COVID-19 recovery, reconnecting with the world. Her comments come on the day that Aotearoa reopened to travellers from 60 visa waiver countries. Our business reporter Nicholas Poynton was at the summit.
In front of an audience of government officials, US representatives and the who's who of corporate New Zealand, the Prime Minister's message was simple.
Today I come to you amid a 6-month exercise of accelerating New Zealand's re-entry onto the world stage.
Jacinda Ardern weighed in on the pandemic, the war on Ukraine, supply chain disruptions and even climate change. But it was building deeper trade ties with the US that took centre stage. She banged a familiar drum, calling for the US to join the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, formerly known as the TPP, and indicated that New Zealand hopes to join the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which is a trade agreement without the removal of tariffs. Jacinda Ardern will lead a trade mission to the US later this year, which she says is about selling the very best of what the country has to offer.
One is to leverage the new work from anywhere culture that has taken off over the past couple of years. One of the few good things to come from the pandemic. In practical terms, it means distance is no longer the barrier it once was. Another is our sustainability credentials. Having an electricity supply that is already over 84% renewable really matters for many players in the market, as we're seeing with the big data centre investments now being announced for the Auckland region.
Air New Zealand Chair Dame Therese Walsh told the summit it's not just investment opportunities that Americans are interested in.
Just recently, we have actually put in place some more research, and that is telling us that at the moment there are 31 million Americans actively considering New Zealand for their next holiday, and 3/4 of those are looking to do it within 6 months of border openings.
You heard that right. 31 million Americans want to come here. Myron Brilliant from the US Chamber of Commerce couldn't contain his surprise during a panel discussion.
I was shocked to hear there are 31 million Americans thinking about going to New Zealand. I have to tell you, I don't think there are 31 million Americans who knew where Ukraine was on a map prior to the conflict. So that's quite an astonishing figure. And let's make sure the U.S. Chamber, the largest business organization in the world, is helping you get to 31 million quickly.
The reopening of the border will mean there's more planes in the air, which should translate to more cargo being transported in the bellies of aircraft. As the theory goes, that should help take the pressure of stretched supply chains, which have been a major driver of global inflation. But Don Braid, the head of the logistics giant Mainfreight, warns there's no end in sight.
The Ukraine crisis has seen a shortage of freighters, and until they find their way back into the market, I think that we will have a problem with air freight rates and air freight space for some time to come.
Don Braid's warning that high freight costs won't fall until next year suggests that while the country's re-emergence on the world stage is a sign of optimism, the economy faces plenty of turbulence ahead.
Right, let's get to some of your feedback here. Two topics have really got you going. Sea level rising, and also our interview with Christopher Luxon. Let's start with the sea first, eh? Anna says, we live in Lyle Bay, moved up the hill a few years ago because of the threat of tsunami. Now it seems that was a good choice based on the new data and sea level projections. I'm always amazed at the amount of new building taking place down on the flat areas in this part of town. Why is it still allowed to happen? Good question. It seems crazy, the lack of foresight, she says. Someone else says, sea level and compensations, I would have thought any environmental impacts would be mulled over before a building consent is issued. Isn't that part of the reason for building consents being granted? And on our interview with Christopher Luxon, it was his pre-budget speech, the pillars of, economic growth. This person says, Chris Luxon, so many questions, no answers. Stephen Lethbridge says, getting tired of Luxon talking about education standards. We are here today due to the 9 years of national standards. And this listener's got in touch to say, I did really well at school and now I'm 41, highly educated with an Ivy League master's, and I can't buy a house. Don't think that school scores and education systems fixes the housing problems. Thanks for your feedback. Do keep it coming. You can text us on 2101 or you can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ. As new COVID cases continue to spread across China, authorities are introducing increasingly extreme measures. Officials in Beijing fear without the strategy, the country's medical system will be overwhelmed. CNN's David Culver reports.
Lockdown in China is like nowhere else on Earth. The country's zero COVID strategy turning millions into virtual prisoners across the nation. Outside of Beijing, these residents forced to hand over their apartment keys so community workers can lock them in from the outside. For those who refuse, crews drill holes to chain the doors shut. In northeastern Jilin province, no need for a lock. Workers installing steel bars to keep people from leaving the building. Right now across China, at least 27 cities are under full or partial lockdown. CNN's calculation estimating that directly impacts up to 180 million people, more than half the U.S. population. For over 2 years now, China's COVID containment has become more extreme, fracturing everyday life. In Shenzhen, a city not under lockdown, babies kept off the subway. The reason? They didn't have negative COVID test results. It's now mandatory to get access to most of public life in the city. To accommodate the new rule, they've opened 24/7 testing sites. A delayed test result had this groom in Xinjiang watching his own wedding ceremony via live stream, not allowed to enter the venue, laughing off the insanity of it all. China's zero tolerance for any new cases comes from the top. President Xi Jinping's tasked Vice Premier Sun Chunlan to oversee major outbreaks. In Shanghai, that means working with the city's most senior official, Communist Party Secretary Li Qiang. Their orders are carried out by the municipal government, which runs the quarantine centers, and coordinated at local levels with thousands of communities. Those local workers are our literal gatekeepers, determining who goes in and out of each compound, facilitating food deliveries, and managing our health information.
In addition to very regular PCR tests, each day we're also required to do rapid antigen tests. We then upload the results to this government app, and then we take a screenshot of that and a picture of the test, and we share it publicly with our community group chat so that all our neighbors can see we're negative.
The community group chats can serve as a helpful way to source food, but also as a space to call out neighbors, sometimes becoming a witch hunt to kick out positive cases and have them sent to quarantine centers.
It has become quite common for local authorities basically say we have a wartime situation and therefore we have to apply emergency measures and therefore you have to simply follow orders.
It reminds some residents of the Cultural Revolution from the 60s and 70s, a painful era of political and social chaos sparked by extreme policies. Criticism of Beijing's zero-COVID strategy is not tolerated from anyone, including the son of a Chinese billionaire who was also sent to a crowded quarantine facility in Shanghai. Wang Zizhong banned from Chinese social media after criticizing the policy. His profile with 40 million followers erased, but not everyone is silenced. Back in Shanghai, many residents confined to their homes, adding to the growing chorus of dissent. As COVID cases surge across China, millions now sentenced to lockdown. Their release date, unknown.
Back home now, and don't do your scone, but be warned, there's a bit of a supply issue with New Zealand wheat. A bad growing season means Edmonds is short on local supply for flour, but Australia's rising to the occasion. To explain what's going on, we're joined by Secretary of the Flour Millers Association, Andy Worrell. Hi, Andy, what went wrong with the growing season, do you know?
Kia ora, Lisa. I guess you need to just talk to the grower representatives about that, but our understanding is that the weather conditions conspired to make a very poor harvest. That is, it was too wet at the time, and the wheat that would otherwise have gone to flour mills to turn into baking flour, in fact, had to effectively be treated as feed wheat, and so that's led to the shortage here.
Normally, how much New Zealand wheat would you mill, Andy, as a percentage of the whole pool?
Oh, I couldn't give you the percentage. I guess it varies from season to season, but most of the wheat that is milled in New Zealand comes from Australia.
All right. So this shortage then, do we know if it's going to have, of New Zealand wheat, is it going to have any impact on price of the milled product?
There's a number of factors at play here, Lisa. What you've got is firstly the poor harvest that you've mentioned. Secondly, the Ukraine-Russia situation, and about 30% of world wheat supplies come out of that region. So the countries that were previously sourcing their wheat from that region are now going to be looking to other suppliers, including Australia, where we get a lot of our wheat from, and simple economics, increased demand, increased price, and that's what we're seeing already.
Yeah, so will it be easy enough to get extra as well, even if the price is higher?
I understand that getting the supply will be okay. It's really just going to be reflected in the cost. That is, there should be sufficient wheat to get into the country, but it's going to come at a price.
Hey, if we did a taste test, could you pick out the difference between Aussie flour and New Zealand flour? Is there a difference?
Well, when flour's milled, it's blended or gristed with different wheat cultivars with different properties to meet the specifications that the bakers require of the flour that they use. So the grist or the mix of the different wheats would be modified to meet those requirements. So I don't expect you would notice any difference in taste.
Because I'm told Aussie spuds are different to Kiwi ones, but not so necessarily with the raw product of the wheat.
Right, yeah, I don't know about that.
What about lags in delivery? Because we're hearing a lot about freighting at the moment, Andy. Everything's hard to get, it seems.
It is. You talk to any importer at the moment, and freight costs are just through the roof, and delivery times are less certain than they have been. Freighting is a problem both in terms of cost and in terms of timing.
How much flour do we use?
In terms of baking flour, milling flour, we produce about 265,000 tonnes of flour in New Zealand each year, somewhere around there.
That's a lot of scones and cakes. And are we still baking like maniacs after the COVID lockdown, do you reckon?
I've noticed when I'm going through the supermarket that there is flour on the shelves now, unlike when the first lockdown, when it was, there were empty shelves and there was real supply problems. But whether that demand is still there, I guess you need to check with the supermarkets.
Thanks for your time, Andy. Really appreciate you coming on the program. That's Andy Worrell, who's from the Flour Millers Association. So you will get your flour. It'll just be made, some of it, with Aussie wheat. The Black Ferns Sevens have fallen just short of a fairy tale return to the world circuit. New Zealand cruised into the final against arch rivals Australia and Canada today, but as Felicity Reid reports, the Trans-Tasman neighbours weren't throwing a welcome back party.
What a final 2 minutes of action, and Australia leave New Zealand bodies scattered all over the Langford turf.
The Blackburn Sevens were unbeaten on their return to the Sevens circuit in Langford until they crossed paths with Australia in a nail-biting final. Leading 17-14 with time up on the clock, the Black Ferns couldn't hold on as the Australians scored a try more than a minute into added time. Australia had already won their first Sevens title since 2018 with a round to spare. But as Australia's Charlotte Caslick explains, the 21-17 win over New Zealand answered the critics.
It would have been bittersweet if we didn't come away with the tournament win, so we'll definitely be celebrating pretty hard tonight.
The Black Ferns, who won Olympic gold in Tokyo last year, have returned for the last 2 rounds of the 2022 series after missing Dubai and Spain due to COVID-19 travel restrictions. Caslick is pleased to have reignited the rivalry so quickly.
Awesome to have New Zealand back on the series. We've been looking forward to playing them for such a long time after obviously not matching up in Tokyo.
Star winger Portia Woodman made history as the Black Ferns stormed their way into the Final Four in Canada. Woodman became the first player to score 200 tries after bagging 2 in New Zealand's 38-0 quarter-final thrashing of the hosts. The 30-year-old's new total of 201 tries left her 46 clear of the next best try scorer, Canadian Bianca Farrell. Woodman says the milestone stuck up on her.
I don't usually take notice of these things and take notice of those numbers, but when you score a try and Tyler Nathan Wong's coming in to kick the conversion and she's like, 3 more to go, P, 2 more to go, P, you kind of can't help it.
Woodman will have an opportunity to add to her tally during the final round of the World Series in France in 17 days' time. Though she says getting across the try line is harder now than it was when New Zealand were last on the circuit.
Everyone's fast. There's no out-and-out tries anymore, so I'm going to have to work on something else to kind of pull out of my pocket. But the girls have changed the way they play. The likes of Canada, the likes of Fiji, they're so fit, they're strong. USA have always been such a strong, competitive team now, so it's exciting.
The Black Ferns are also using the World Series as preparation for their gold medal defence at the Commonwealth Games in August.
This is exactly what we need, and I think today's loss is a good little reminder that we've still got a lot to work on, and we're really excited about that. I like losing in some ways. Like, well, don't get me wrong, I hate losing with a passion, but when we lose, we learn so much more from it. You're not complacent. You're always trying to find ways to be better, and you're always fighting to be better.
The Black Ferns now have a couple of weeks to bounce back and rest weary bodies before they do it all again in Toulouse.
Now, an auction that's bound to make a splash. The last of 80 New Zealand-designed whale tails are about to go under the hammer at Auckland's Viaduct. The colourful creations have been dotted around Tamaki Makaurau since January. Our reporter Nick Trubridge joins us from downtown Auckland now. Nick, tell us about these tails and where are you?
Oh, hi Lisa. Well, if you're watching on TV, you probably can't see me because I'm behind this giant whale tail. It's just under 6 foot. It's one of, as you say, about 80 that have been dotted around Auckland. How much length has there been in between all these whales, you ask? I know you're asking that at home. Well, they're telling me here that 8,000 kilometres has been covered by people going around these whales while they've been in Auckland. In terms of scans, you can scan each one as you see it. 11,000 scans, Lisa. In terms of cool stories about these whale towers, well, the CEO of WWF here was telling me earlier that there was one gentleman, an 80-year-old chap, lives alone. He went through all 80 tails, 80 to 80, and he did it all on public transport. As people can see behind me if they're watching, if you can't and you're listening, there's a big auction on tonight. There are 80 of these things, of course. The last of them, well, they're about to go under the hammer right here. It's starting to fill up down at Auckland's Viaduct.
Nick, I've got so many questions, but before we get to more of them, why are they being sold off? What's happening with the money?
Oh, the money. What's happening with the money? The money. Well, it's going to WWF. It's going to all the work they do to keep our oceans healthy, to keep our taonga in check, including these beautiful birds, whales as well. That's who it's going to.
So, do we know if they're to scale these tails of whales, Nick? Is this actually the size of what, your average whale tail in real life, I mean?
It's a good question. I mean, we're talking about the biggest animals on Earth, whether or not. I mean, I'm for people watching at home. I'm about 6'2", so this is just under 6 foot. I don't know if they're life size, but look, I'm guessing this could be maybe a baby bird's whale or something like that. Not sure exactly. Back to the money though, because of course tonight is all about, well, apart from being all about whales and WWF, it's all about the money as well. Harcourts is holding the auction here. They're estimating that prices will be between $5,000. Okay, you'd be kind of happy if you were one of these artists and you got $5,000 for your design, but all the way up to $50,000. That's the aim here tonight, we've told. One of these beautiful tails designed by a New Zealand artist for $50,000.
And what do people think they'll do with them? Because I'm wondering, I mean, they're large and are they heavy? Do we know?
Let me check. Hang on.
Oh, don't be lifting it, Nick. You may be buying it if something goes wrong with it.
They're not too bad, actually. They're sort of, I would say that is a good 30 kilo. What will people do with them? Yeah, sorry, I won't break it. What will people do with them? Hard to know. I mean, I suppose it depends how much space you have. I'm sort of starting to get enamoured by this beautiful design with sort of beautiful bahutakawas and little birds and little blue flowers on it. Little ko-fi pods there as well. What would I do with it? Well, I would put it on my my sort of 2 by 4 metre deck space in Mount Eden.
So it wouldn't fit inside the flat?
People can look up to it. No, it wouldn't sit inside the flat, but you can sort of sit on the couch, you can look out to it on the deck.
Hey, just a quick question also. If people are keen, can they still get down there in time?
You can't. This event, I believe, is invite only, but it's interesting you should ask this because they aren't all going here. There are virtual auctions online as well. So if you're still looking to get in on the action, you can go online, you can bid in those. Also, if you've missed the walk around Auckland, and you've missed the walk around these 80 beautiful whale tails, well, there's still a virtual tour, and you can do that online as well.
Thanks, Nick. That's Nick Truebridge joining us from downtown Auckland there. Do check it out online because they're beautiful, some of them. And the one he was standing next to, just under his height, as he says, about 6 foot. Beautiful birds, bahutakawa flowers all over them. They're absolutely gorgeous. And as he said, you can still do a virtual tour if you hadn't had the opportunity to see them. A lot of you getting in touch about, well, sea level rise. This person says people or individuals should have the brains to figure the water is coming up. I do get sick and tired of hearing that the government should be doing something. That's baloney. I'm green and a smart person. Come on. Do you really want such a nanny state, they say? More on this after 6.
RNZ News at 6. Kia ora tātou. Good evening. I'm Evie Ashton. Wellington's mayor says actions are already being taken to reduce the number of properties affected by sea level rise. New data shows most of the country's coastal areas are sinking and will be hit faster and harder than expected. Mayor Andy Foster has told Checkpoint the council's next district plan will reduce new building in areas at high risk from natural hazards such as sea rise, flooding or slips.
In the high-risk areas, you'd need a special consent that would be hard to get. So think sort of sensitive like childcare centres and hospitals and things like that. But also the government's recent 3 houses per property would not apply in those areas, which are subject to inundation, so you wouldn't be able to densify.
Tamaki Drive in eastern Auckland is one of the prized coastal areas in the forefront of grim new predictions about sea level rise. Auckland Councillor Desley Simpson says council is trying to lift whole sections of road to help future-proof it.
So we've been able to raise it up and we're pretty confident now that it won't take significant flooding as a result of that very expensive and intensive engineering that went around raising Tamaki Drive. Noting that Tamaki Drive was originally built, in the Depression, so it sort of stood a long time.
3 years ago, a study described waves crashing over the walls on Tamaki Drive as a critical threat, which could cause damage to seawalls and pavements. The Prime Minister has again ruled out introducing a wealth tax after comments on breakfast television led to accusations she might. The National Party launched an attack in response, saying New Zealanders can't trust Labour on tax. Jacinda Ardern reiterated on the AM show this morning she wouldn't introduce a capital gains tax while she's Prime Minister, but didn't rule out a wealth tax. National Party leader Christopher Luxon says Ms Ardern was signalling she plans to introduce such a tax, but at her post-cabinet media conference this afternoon, Ms Ardern said her policy to not introduce a wealth tax remains unchanged. 2 recent arrivals into New Zealand are now isolating at their homes as a second person is confirmed with the BA4 variant of Omicron. But the Ministry of Health says the current health settings are adequate. Kay Albert reports.
The first case of the new subvariant at the border was reported yesterday after the passenger arrived from South Africa on April the 22nd. The Ministry of Health says there's no evidence so far to show that BA4 is more transmissible or causes more severe disease than other Omicron variants. Today's COVID-19 update shows 6,636 new community cases. Another 7 people with COVID-19 have died, taking the total since the pandemic began to 757. 480 people are in hospital, 12 are in either an ICU or a high dependency unit.
Ukrainian civilians who have been evacuated from Mariupol have been speaking about the ordeal of sheltering from constant Russian bombardment. Many spent weeks in bunkers and tunnels under the Azovstal steel complex. This report from Laura Bicker of the BBC.
We saw some women and children heading into an evacuation centre. These are people who have been in tunnels for 60 days. It's very rare here in Zaporizhzhia to meet people who have managed to make their way out of Mariupol. And I met a family. They'd all shoved their way into this really battered car. And he told me he was counting 60 to 80 shells a day.
It was non-existent. 9-floor buildings were turned into 3- and 4-floor buildings. Smaller ones are gone completely.
The hope is for this humanitarian corridor that in the next few days, perhaps even weeks, that this works.
New Zealand has imposed further sanctions on Russia. The latest round targets the 170 members of the upper house of Russia's parliament and 6 defence companies and organisations which have contributed to the Ukraine invasion. The sanctions forbid them from travelling to New Zealand or carrying out any activity here. Foreign Minister Nanaia Mahuta says New Zealand is committed to holding President Putin to account. And a series of events to attract people back into Auckland's struggling city centre begin this week. The council's cleaning streets and squares, sprucing up planter boxes and increasing security to help people feel safe. Amy Williams reports.
The council's economics unit says the number of Aucklanders working in the city has dropped 7% to 115,500. Among them are financial and professional services staff who in normal times have accounted for 70% of the area's economic growth. City of Colour is the first event designed to attract workers and visitors back. More than 50 light and art installations will colour landmarks from Friday. Mayor Phil Goff says it's part of a plan to kickstart the city centre's recovery and boost business.
That's the news.
Kia ora, I'm Emil Donovan, and today on The Detail, the long-running story of a South Korean man living in New Zealand and whether he can be extradited to China to face a murder charge. Why are our extradition cases so convoluted?
There's this human rights concern. Are we really sure that China is going to safeguard Kim's human rights in the same way that New Zealand would if he were to face trial here?
The Detail on Apple, Spotify, RNZ, or wherever you get your podcasts.
And we're funded through New Zealand On Air. You're back with Lisa Owen on Checkpoint next. Right now, the short forecast from NZUS to midnight Tuesday. For Northland, Auckland, Coromandel and Bay of Plenty, fine and cloudy periods with isolated showers. Mostly fine for Waikato, Waitomo, Taumarunui, Taupo and Taihape. Some areas of fog overnight. Mostly cloudy from Taranaki to Wellington. A few showers about Taranaki, Kapiti and Wellington that are clearing later tomorrow. Gisborne, Hawke's Bay and Wairarapa have fine weather with a few clouds. Nelson and Marlborough, cloudy periods and a few showers, becoming confined to Golden Bay and the outer Marlborough Sounds tomorrow. Mostly fine for Canterbury, Otago and Southland. However, there is the odd shower about Stewart Island, some brief rain possible in North Canterbury until this evening, and low cloud or fog about Canterbury Plains from tomorrow evening. For Bulla, Westland and Fiordland, mainly fine about northern Fiordland and southern Westland, occasional rain or showers elsewhere. And for Te Kohu, Chatham Islands, cloud is increasing. There are a few showers developing tonight. It's 6 minutes past 6. We'll have news headlines for you at 6:30.
Nā mihi iwi, no mai hoki mai. This is Checkpoint, ko Lisa Owen tēnei. Authorities are in a race against time to save one of Auckland's most iconic waterfront areas and transport routes. Tamaki Drive is one of the most prized coastal areas in the forefront of grim new predictions about sea level rise. It's happening twice as fast as previously thought, according to a new report. So what do residents and visitors think? Katie Todd and camera operator Marika Habazi headed out to find out.
A key transport route, a popular cafe paradise, a haven to Saturday morning dog walkers, and also one of the most vulnerable places in Auckland to sea level rise. The water's now predicted to seep 30 centimetres closer to homes and shops on Tamaki Drive, much faster than previously thought, in 15 to 18 years. It's unwelcome news for those who love this area of eastern Auckland.
I'm just wondering whether we will be able to enjoy all this, come, 15 years? Yeah, it's quite fast. Yeah, it is quite a lot of water to come back up, and if we lose our beautiful beach, it will be disappointing.
The threat of sea level rise isn't new to Tamaki Drive. 5 years ago, residents held a public meeting on the issue, and 3 years ago, a study described waves crashing over the walls on Tamaki Drive as a critical threat, which could cause damage to seawalls and pavement surfaces and could potentially threaten pedestrians and cars. That has happened. While the area might look pretty placid on a low tide, storm waves have come surging over this 1930s seawall several times in the past year alone. Sandbags are used so frequently here, the council now intends to replace them with gates. It's one of many steps that Auckland Councillor Desley Simpson says is underway. The council's also trying to lift whole sections of road.
We're pretty confident now that it won't take significant flooding as a result of that very expensive and intensive engineering that went around raising Tamaki Drive. Noting that Tamaki Drive was originally built, in the Depression, so it sort of stood a long time. On top of that, we've also added some very large stormwater, catchment areas to take the overflow as well.
Waterfront properties fetch premium prices, but the sea level predictions are not deterring some prospective buyers who are keeping their faith in the council's actions. That's according to local real estate agent Barfoot and Thompson's Paula Kane.
They want to live and enjoy this amazing environment we have right now. They could be run over by bus tomorrow. So I don't feel it's actually encroaching the immediate property values along here and what people are prepared to pay.
But others, it seems, are worried. An online NZ Sea Rise tool was launched today for checking the impacts of sea level rise on a particular address. It was hit by a cyber attack, which stopped people being able to check whether their areas are under threat.
And if you're listening to that one on radio, check out Katie and Marika's story. The video version will be on our webpage. Meanwhile, an Auckland councillor says it's ludicrous councils can't stop new homes being built on private land that will flood in the next 2 decades due to rising sea levels. Richard Hills is chair of the Super Cities Environment and Climate Change Committee and reckons the new research and mapping tool is pretty scary stuff.
It does always freak me out, but it doesn't surprise me. I guess that's what everything to do with climate change is currently doing in this country and globally. It's rushing further and faster than we all expected, but the scientists have been saying this for 30 or 40 years now.
So did you know it was this bad?
I was shocked to see these figures, that it's so quick, but then in another sense, you just have to look around that we've been having 1 in 100 year floods sort of every month all around the country. I can think of one Monday in March we had 110 mils of rain in an hour across most of Auckland, significant flooding, about 500 serious call-outs. Last year in lockdown, we had this similar in out northwest QMU, significant flooding. And these are sort of called 1 in 100 year or 1 in 500 year floods, and they're happening monthly. So I guess, although these figures today are shocking, probably if you just look around to what's been happening in the last couple of years, you can tell that things are moving much faster than expected.
So what does it change in terms of council plans? Because you're looking at a 10 to 20 year time frame for some significant, catastrophic sea levels, whereas before you might have been thinking you had 50 to 60 years. So what changes?
Yeah, I guess it's just another wake-up call that we have to move faster. We have to reduce our emissions. Yes, we are small, but there's 100 countries like us that make up over a third of global emissions. So if we all just ignored that, then we'd be making a significant problem for the whole of the world. So we have to dramatically reduce our emissions, but also adapting. With public assets, we're doing what we're calling shoreline adaptation plans right across the city. We funded that last year to get a good look at all our public assets, so that's roads, parks, wharves and things that keep getting smashed during storms, what we shouldn't be doing in that area. But on private land, we're still waiting for sort of government lead there, because we cannot create precedent where we start trying to protect or save or spend, having to increase the rates a bunch to try and save or protect private land. And I don't know if a lot of people realise that actually there's no plan to protect their private assets from this kind of rapid change.
Richard, in terms of private land, right, houses, is the council already marking land information with at-risk properties in terms of sea levels?
We have what is sort of some coastal inundation zoning. It doesn't tell people, and we can't legally under the RMA stop people building in those zones, but it sort of starts to tell a picture to people what risk they're putting themselves in. And I guess insurance companies will start looking at that and going, well, we're not going to insure that addition to your house or whatever it is. But the government has just released their draft national adaptation plan, which includes some of the direction that may be, may lead us to in that space. But at the moment, we can only kind of lead people to the water, or the water's coming to them. There's not a lot we can do to prevent builds in those coastal inundation zones right now.
Doesn't that seem like lunacy, that you know all of this, yet you, are obliged to consent properties, all being equal, to go up in areas that you know are going to be trouble?
Yeah, it does sound ludicrous. We can give all the information that we can, but we can't actually prevent people doing what they're doing on their own private land. We can, and we're trying to address public land and where we need to protect and where we need to retreat. But we're waiting for government direction. There has been a couple of years in this adaptation space, and there are changes to the RMA that are coming. But the current housing direction also limits our ability to protect upzoning in those coastal areas too.
So when we're talking about inundation, coastal inundation, if someone were to build a house now in an area that is identified in this new mapping system as being a danger zone, then is that on them? You're on your own, do you reckon?
At this stage, that is on them. So the government's put out their draft plan last week or the week before, and it says, they've put a high-level statement out there that basically government or councils aren't going to save you, but they are saying it needs to be a combined effort between community, insurance companies, government and local government on a way forward. So we're waiting for that direction, because we can't we can't legally do what we can. There have been times we've tried to stop things, and often it gets taken to court and we lose. So we need that kind of national guidance around what's this going to look like, because we don't want another leaky home situation where we're all taxpayers and ratepayers are paying for private properties to be fixed because of mistakes of the past. So this is another one of those tipping points where it might not sound a lot to some people, 30 centimetres, but if that's 30 centimetres in the next 15 to 18 years, and all you need is a few big storms, which we know with climate change are going to increase, that you could be having these sort of significant inundations or not only flooding, but we see the cliffs and the coast being washed away. This could be happening much faster.
Richard, ratepayers are going to pay anyway, aren't they? Goodbye rates cap, because this is going to be expensive and somebody's got to stump up the money.
Well, yeah, and that's why we need to know exactly what it looks like and to give people
So expect
that
your rates bill to
long-term.
go up along with the water.
I mean, we're being careful about private, and this is why we need to know. I can't see anyone being happy that we're spending ratepayers' money on private protection of coastal properties, but we are already putting in significant tens of millions a year of ratepayers' money in protecting, fixing, rebuilding seawalls, rebuilding, I think in the Tasman Tempest, that massive storm we had, was about 150 slips and wharves and other structures got knocked down. But everyone expects us to rebuild those wharves and those community assets as they are. Often we will be using our own advice to say it's actually ludicrous to do this because another 5 years it'll be washed away again. So those are the really tough conversations we're having in our shoreline adaptation plan consultations to tell people or show people and bring them along with us. Okay, what's important to you? What should we protect? What should we not? What can't we protect? Or what is going to cost $1 million every year to fix? Which will, like you say, if we just keep throwing money at things to try and pretend climate change isn't happening, we will see those rates go up if we don't have a clear plan and the community don't get on board with a clear understanding of what's going to happen.
Richard Hills there, Auckland Councillor. It is almost 18 minutes past 6 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Australia's federal election campaign is at the halfway point and Labor is holding a commanding lead, according to two major polls. Cost of living issues are still dominating and now it's the cost of health that the major parties are focusing on, with both promising cheaper medicines. The ABC's David Lipson says there's a clear trend.
These polls have a margin of error of close to 3%. There's also 3 crucial weeks to go before polling day. But just past this halfway point, we are seeing this clear trend continuing that puts Anthony Albanese in a winning position. The coalition not gaining the ground that it would have wanted to, like they did in 2019. So first to the news poll, it shows a two-party preferred number of 53 to 47. In Labor's favour. That would represent a loss of 10 seats for the coalition. They hold government by just 1 seat right now. Both the leaders are in the negatives when it comes to net satisfaction, which really tells the story on why so many people are turning away from the major parties. The minor parties and the independents in this news poll add up to 26% of the vote, which isn't that far below the major parties. In terms of the 9 papers survey by Resolve, it tells a similar story. Labor in front, in fact, in a stronger position. 54-46 is the two-party preferred number in Labor's favour. Perhaps what's most interesting in that poll is that support for the Greens has surged to 15%, up 4 points. Now, as always, preferences will be crucial to the major parties' chances of winning. And as always, we can't exactly predict which way those preferences will go. The coalition, in a thematic sense, is trying to play on the historical perceptions of coalition strength in managing the economy. Labor's saying, well, you've had 9 years in government and things are no better for ordinary Australians. The coalition today is promising an extra 50,000 older Australians access to the Commonwealth Seniors Health Card, which will give them some cheaper medical services and prescription medicines.
Thousands of people have taken to the streets in Sri Lanka protesting about the economic crisis that has led to severe shortages of essential goods. Dwindling foreign currency reserves mean the island nation of 22 million is struggling to pay for fuel, food and medicine imports. The latest rally in Colombo is the culmination of a week of demonstrations. The BBC's Ambarasan Ithrajan reports.
A bruised economy bringing thousands to the streets. The country has run out of cash, struggles to import essential items. These Sri Lankans aren't giving up. They demand a course correction.
People are dying in the queues.
Vimarsana Ranasinghe has been camping here for 18 days. For people like her, basics have become luxury.
You cannot afford to live here. Food prices are increasing day by day, and shortage of fuel, gas and all other essential goods, and also medicine. So it's very difficult to live.
A classic case of a country living beyond its means. Now, Colombo is running from pillar to post for loans. A rude awakening for Sri Lankans.
I have been coming to Sri Lanka for the past 25 years, and these protests are quite extraordinary. Ethnic fault lines, they run very deep here in Sri Lanka, but the cost of living crisis has brought three major communities, the Sinhalese, Muslims and Tamils together.
Elsewhere in Colombo, in a show of strength, the opposition turned up in huge numbers.
The present government has led our country into total bankruptcy. There's abject poverty in all sectors of society. This government is an incompetent government.
Government is on a back foot.
We missed the point. We should have known. For example, 2020, when we started with a fresh government, no one can say that we didn't have the facts. I mean, if you are a good analyst of the economic situation, you should have known that this is coming. The only thing that you couldn't have predicted was the corona impact.
The country's economic recovery is going to be long and arduous. These people want to ensure the government gets it right this time.
The Speaker of the US House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, has made a surprise visit to Ukraine for talks with President Volodymyr Zelensky. She says America will stand with Ukraine until, in her words, the fight is done. She also says Congress will move quickly to deliver $51 billion worth of aid that's been proposed by President Biden. The BBC's Ben Brown has more.
Nancy Pelosi is the latest high-profile international political figure to come to Kyiv and offer President Zelensky moral support. And he's getting much more than that from the United States, some $33 billion worth of economic, humanitarian and military assistance promised by President Biden. Speaking in Poland after Nancy Pelosi had left Ukraine, she said Ukraine is fighting for everyone's freedom.
Do not be bullied by bullies. If they're making threats, you cannot back down. That's my view of it, that we're there for the fight, and you cannot fold to a bully.
Russia is now stepping up its offensive on the Eastern Front in Donbass, raining down rockets, artillery and tank fire on Ukrainian trenches and bunkers. After 2 months on the front line, these Ukrainian troops from the 81st Brigade are now pulling back for a short rest, a break from the relentless Russian onslaught that has killed and injured many of their colleagues. A combat doctor treats some of the troops for trench foot because they haven't been able to change soaking wet boots and socks.
This is a good opportunity for the boys to rest and to return to the fight with new energy, to recover physically, morally and psychologically.
But before too long, his men will be heading back to the front line, perhaps to face an even more ferocious Russian attack. This war, which President Putin had hoped would only last for a few days, could now rage on for months or even years to come, consuming more lives with every passing day.
Regine Zilberberg, who claimed to have invented the discotheque, has died. She was 92 and established an international nightclub empire which became a playground for the rich and famous in the 1970s and 80s. The BBC's Hugh Schofield reports on the life of the French entrepreneur who became known as the Queen of the Night.
Rain started dropping, drop, drop, drop. It was in 1953 at the Whiskey A Go-Go Club just behind the Palais Royal in Paris that Regine said that she had her inspiration. She told me once that the problem with the jukeboxes that clubbers used back then to listen to American imports was the silence in between the songs. It was embarrassing, she said. You could hear people snogging. And so Regine claimed to be the first person to install 2 turntables. She personally spanned the records and the music never stopped. We kept rocking, rock, rock, rock. She claimed it was the first ever disco, which may or may not be true, but became part of the story. Later in the 50s, she opened the first Chez Regine in the Latin Quarter. Her stories were legion, how she taught the twist to the former King Edward VIII and danced the samba with Prince Charles. The brand went global when she moved to New York in the 1970s, and at one point it was said that you could dance in the Regines somewhere in the world just about round the clock. Regine didn't just run the discos, she also sang. Her French version of Gloria Gaynor's I Will Survive came out in 1979, and Regine did keep going. Her empire dwindled as tastes changed and the franchises disappeared. But she never lost her love for showbiz. Well into her 80s, she was planning more ventures, more ways of getting people to dance.
And finally tonight, parents at an upcoming graduation ceremony in Texas will be forgiven for seeing double, because they actually are. Mansfield High School thinks they may even break a world record with 35 sets of graduating seniors, along with one set of triplets. Nick Starling went to meet all of them.
You aren't seeing double, just dozens of Mansfield ISD seniors who happen to be twins.
I'm surprised how many twins showed up.
To document this unique and special moment.
Photo and video of Ash is going to be right up there. He's the guy in the suit.
This twin and triplet class of 2022 gathered on this football field, many with their caps and gowns to take pictures. Their parents also capturing this memory.
I mean, it's really amazing. We're really blessed.
Stella Robertson's kids are Anthony and Angela.
It's great being a twin. You know, we don't necessarily look alike, but that bond is still there just as much as any of the twins here.
After graduation, they're separating. Angela to Yale University and Anthony to the University of Houston.
It would definitely be a change because we're not going to be together like we've always been, but you know, you can always still call each other, text each other.
Other twins like Avery and Keaton Slimak want to stay together, attending the University of Texas, and will be roommates.
We're pretty much best friends. We do everything together, and we get along really well, so excited to stay together.
Being identical twins, the sisters admit, can present some challenges.
It can be confusing for people, definitely. I've gotten pretty used to being called by her name.
Looking alike can also be fun.
It's fun to pull pranks on people, too. Yeah. We've switched classes plenty of times.
It's a bittersweet moment for many of these twins, as they'll soon make the transition from high school to whatever comes next.
Just knowing that it's almost over is exciting, but it's also kind of sad to leave that away.
What a cool story. Pretty much all we've got time for. Let's get some of your last thoughts on sea level rise. This listener says, hi Lisa, currently $750,000 to $1 million units are going up now on Napier's Marine Parade, 30 to 40 metres from the shoreline. Sam says same thing happened in Christchurch when developers forced council to not put risks of liquefaction into land titles and to allow development in the east of Christchurch. We know what happened there, don't we? And another person says we should be able to build understanding the risk and still be able to have houses covered for fire, etc., if they don't want to cover for floods. And this one too, if councils are issuing building consents under the Building Act, then the council and the building owner are saying that it will last for 50 years. Councils need to start saying no to consents. And that's all we've got time for. Stay tuned to the late news. I'll keep you updated throughout the night. Catch up on Checkpoint on Spotify if you need to. Ko te kaupapa tuatahi o Pōpō tomorrow from 5. School's back for term 2. But first up, finds out if that means masks are optional. Heaps of videos online from tonight and our stories. Kaua e wariwari te atatero I a mātou kōrero. Check them out online. We'll be back tomorrow. Have a great evening. Thank you so much for your company.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. Kia ora tātou, I'm Evie Ashton. Wellington's mayor says the council plans to reduce new building in areas at high risk from sea rise, flooding or slips to reduce the number of properties affected by coastal change. The Prime Minister is again ruling out introducing a wealth tax after comments led to accusations she might. A second person at the border has tested positive for the BA4 variant of Omicron.